Okay, so we're going to go in and sort of rough this cutting board up. We're going to rough it up like a cutting board would be that's been used in the real world for a while. And the number one way to figure out what a cutting board looks like after it's been used for a while is to go get reference. I got a couple of pictures that I've looked up here. Here's just a couple samples. And what I've realized is that number one, cutting boards have a lot of cuts in them. The cuts do appear to be a little bit more white, a little bit more diffuse, a little bit more roughness, less metallic. But there also are places where it gets stained with juices as it gets cut over time. Those areas tend to be a little bit more reflective. They tend to be a little bit less rough. So those are the sort of things that we're going to put into our cutting board. The first thing we're going to look at is our base layer. Now, our base layer, we're not going to need height. We've got our color map. But what about roughness and metallic? How reflective is the cutting board itself? The answer is not very. It probably has a little bit of reflectivity because everything does, but we're not going to see a lot in there. Unless your cutting board has a nice stain on it. And this one probably has a little bit of a staining, so I probably will give it like 3.5 metallic. As for roughness, it's not really going to have much coming out of it because it's got that glaze on it, it's brand new. So it's going to be fairly low roughness and a little bit of metallic on it. But as we see, we can't really see much reflected in our dome, just kind of the main light. Now, next up, let's talk about our scratches. So first off, we're going to use the scratch brush, which is one of my favorite brushes, Scratch 2. Just like in Photoshop, you can use the brackets to increase your brush size. The flow kind of is like an opacity control a little bit. You also have stroke opacity. But as you can see, it kind of controls the contrast. I want mine to be pretty high contrast. Spacing, it just spaces out the alpha image. As you can see, there's a ton of alphas. And what this is doing is just using that slash mark to sort of get the alpha. With that, I think we're ready to go. Oh, we just got to control this. What color should we have? Well, let's look at our reference. Probably much lighter than the actual color of our cutting board. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this. Use the color selection brush. Just going to grab a nice bright area. And then we're going to desaturate it a little bit more. Probably lower the value a tad because it was a bit extra with the light. And then height. So we're going to go a little bit lower in the height. And always go a little bit further than you need because we can go back, but we can't add extra. Roughness, super high in the cuts. Very, very rough. Metallic, pretty low. Because it's probably chipping away at that sealant, and we're just going to see the raw wood underneath, which is what we see in our reference. We're going to copy our reference, always. So with that said, let's jump right in. I'm a little bit confused on my orientation here, so let's just really quickly, all. Okay, yeah, this is where I want. And with that, we are ready to cut. Notice in our reference, the cuts seem to be pretty uniform at either parallel or perpendicular angles, with a little bit of jitter. And that is where angle jitter comes in, because we can control our angle. And angle jitter, we don't want 180. We want very little angle jitter. Size jitter, a little bit. Flow jitter, no. Maybe just a tad. This is really bright. Can't even see what I'm doing. All right, let's do it. Yeah. And just rotate the other way and get some going in the other direction. Get out of here, son. Don't go overboard. A lot of references tend to go a little bit overboard because it's either like no detail or this cutting board's been used for 50 years by my grandma. So keep that in mind. I've gotten some feedback from some pretty high-ranking guys that have been like, yeah, we're going a little bit overboard on the detail, on the grunge. All right. So, yeah, those scratches, those are some pretty serious scratches, let's be honest here. Look at how deep those are. A little bit more. I assume I'm like cutting carrots, and I cut like a bunch in one spot. But I cut a little bit down here. All right. If you got too much, you can always go in and erase it out. There's an eraser tool. Just be like, maybe a little bit less. And with that, we can pop over to our layers. I'm going to go back to the brush tool in case I forget. And we can control the opacity like we're used to. But here's the kicker. I can control the opacity for just the height if I choose to. And knock that back. I can barely see what's going on. I can control the base color, of course. We could even control the roughness and metallic by channel. As usual, these have blending modes, so we could use multiply, we could use linear dodge, overlay, whichever you want. Now, I promised I would talk about tangent warp. So what this does, tangent warp is kind of normal brush mode. UV respects the UV shell borders. Normally it doesn't. If I was to paint on this edge, right down here, it would paint across the UVs. And normally that's what we'd expect, but sometimes we have areas where we don't want it to go across UVs, and then we use UV. I'm gonna leave it on tangent warp. There's actually no reason to do otherwise. I also want to talk briefly about the geometry mode. This is super fun because when you're masking, this allows you to mask by face, by UV shell, by vertice, which can be really, really useful if you have a lot of shells. We don't have any projects like this in that demo, but if you're doing a character or a complicated asset, masking by shell so you could for some reason mask out the shoulder plate as metal would be really, really useful. As opposed to like the clothes and the shirt and the face, you could mask those out really quickly if you've already considered that when making your UV shells. So right now you can start to sort of piece together in your head how that can improve my workflow if I UV my UVs smartly. I could take this bottom and say, you know what, I want you to be rubber, and really quickly mask it out. So let's go ahead and check that out. We're just going to make another fill material. And I'm going to use one of the default materials in Substance so you can see kind of what happens. And we'll just do rubber. I know there's a rubber. Okay, so let's test that out. And what we're going to do is we're going to go down here to Smart Materials, and we're just going to grab some rubber tire. We're going to put that, we'll put it below our scratches. That looks weird. Okay, guys. Sorry, I had a little bit of a technical issue there. Let's go ahead and let's create a mask, just so we can see sort of how that UV selection works. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create this rubber tire smart material. Okay, we fixed that. All right, now let's go ahead and we're just going to create a white mask by right-clicking on the layer. And hopefully we can fix that. Make it go away. Make it go away. Make it go away. I don't like it. There we are. Weird issue. Now, we're going to take this and we're going to use that UV mode. We're going to go over here and we're going to tell it black for this shell. So now we got rubber on the bottom. We got cutting board on the top. That can be really useful for masking out details. Let's just leave that there. That's kind of fun.